Hello, book lover. Let me set this image straight. How are you? Welcome to our second session of the guided reading of Jane Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility. Welcome, welcome. Let's see, I'm not sure if this microphone is working, but let me know if the sound is good, if the image is good. Also, let me know if you have your tea ready for today's session. Tea time with Jane Austen and Books and Culture. Let me know if you're live. I can see there are some people live. Welcome. So, so we started this project last week. Hi, Thais. Hello. Welcome. We started this project last week, and we're going to go on this literary journey together to read Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. We'll talk about her life, about her writing career, but mainly about the text itself. Hi, Jenny. Nice to see you. You have your coffee. Coffee is also a good option. West Side. Yeah, live and so excited for today's chapters. Great. I love the enthusiasm. Megan, I'm live, coffee ready, and super excited. Excellent. So today we're going to talk about chapters 2 to 5. So you can follow along as you like if you prefer to read the chapters in advance or if you prefer to read them along with me or both. So you have a very good understanding of the novel. So if you were not here last time, let me briefly introduce myself. So I am Fernanda. I am a literature teacher. I teach 18th and 19th century English literature mainly, but love literature in general, and also teach how you can become a creative reader and explore reading in a more meaningful, engaging, inspiring, insightful way at the Creative Reader Academy. And I have been creating something new, which is very cool. I'm very excited about it. Creating the Jane Austen course, the Jane Austen Club, it's called, which will be available in March if everything goes well. So I've already written and recorded a class on Jane Austen's life, on the Austen family, and on the Regency era. So the contextual information we need to understand Jane Austen's writing career. So you can, of course, follow this live. Great. Hello from Turkey, Bahrain. I hope I say it correctly. Welcome, welcome. And if you cannot make it the whole session, or if you cannot make it live, you can always watch the recordings. They're available on the channel. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so you can receive notifications if there's any new content. All right. So last time we talked about how this project is going to work. We talked about our love for Jane Austen. We read the first chapter together, and let's look at the topics we discussed. So the introduction to the characters, the Dashwood family, the importance of reputation and respectability in Regency England, something that was very, very important. So if you lost your reputation, your social life was ruined, and especially in the social circles that we're dealing with in Jane Austen's novels. So upper middle class and upper class. So that was very important. We talked about the strict settlement by entailment, which is what happens to the estate at Sense and Sensibility. So Norland Park actually at the beginning of the novel belongs to the father of Eleanor, Marianne, Margaret, and his first son from the first marriage, John, But because of this law, women were not allowed to inherit property at the time. A similar thing happened to Jane Austen when her father died. So after the father Dashwood died, his property passed on to the closest male relative, which in this case is his first son from his first marriage, John Dashwood. And nothing for the girls. No estate, no property for the girls, except for an amount of money he was able to save to leave for them. And before he dies, he asks John Dashwood for a promise that he would take care of his sisters, his half sisters. And he promises to do so. We'll see how that plays out today. We talked about the importance of marriage for women at a time, especially because of these laws, right? Like this, women were not allowed to inherit property from their fathers, for instance, or from their husbands. So in reality, they had right to very little. So in order to have a comfortable life and to be someone legally at the time, you had to be someone's daughter, wife, or sister, yes, but always in relation to a male counterpart, right? So you see how important it is for a woman at the time to marry so that she could have a life in a place of her own. We talked about the difference between Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice and Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice, their understandings of what marriage is. This is another theme that will permeate Sense and Sensibility. So marriage was a very practical decision for women at the time, not only a matter of the heart, although some women believed or really hoped for that to happen. Marianne Dashwood is one of these romantic girls who believe in marriage as a matter of the heart. And so here we are in chapter 2. We're going to read together and comment chapters 2 to 5. And if you have any questions or comments along the way, please write them down. I would love to have this as a conversation and not just a one-sided lecture, let's say. So I hope you participate. And let's start reading chapter 2. Today we'll talk about some special topics such as Jane Austen's ironic tone. That's very characteristic of her writing. How she changes perspectives between characters and how that affects the way that she uses language. So, for instance, we'll start chapter 2. Let me know which character's perspective we're reading that chapter from, and how that affects the use of language and how it changes throughout the novel. So we don't get a one-sided view of the events, but we as readers get the chance to travel from character's mind to character's mind to know what's going on in their heads. And that changes the type of language that Austen uses, because the language mirrors the character's personality, right? We'll talk about how Mrs. John Dashwood, so John Dashwood's wife, how she comes to Norland Park and she takes control. She invades and dominates the space, and the role that she has in the future of the Dashwood girls. There will be new characters introduced. We'll see who they are. And one very important theme that we'll start now in these chapters are the different perceptions on love, feelings, and demonstration of feelings by Eleanor and Marianne, right? We talked about their characterization last time and how they each embodies or incorporates one of the 2 words from the title, sense and sensibility. So Eleanor is the embodiment of sense, of prudence, of holding back, of respectability, of discretion. She uses that word a lot. Or rather, Jane Austen uses that word a lot when we're reading the text through Eleanor's perspective. And Marianne is the embodiment of sensibility, of extravagant feelings, exaggeration, romanticism, right? Um, all right, so let's start with chapter 2. It's the conversation between Mrs. John Dashwood and her husband, John Dashwood, the girl's half brother, and how this conversation will affect the lives of these girls. So let's start. Mrs. John Dashwood now installed herself mistress of Norland, and her mother and sisters in law were degraded to the condition of visitors. As such, however, they were treated by her with quiet civility, and by her husband with as much kindness as he could feel towards anybody beyond himself, his wife, and their child. He really pressed them with some earnestness to consider Norland as their home, and as no plan appeared so eligible to Mrs. Dashwood as remaining there till she could accommodate herself with a house in the neighborhood, his invitation was accepted. Now, can you imagine the situation? So, the girls, Eleanor, Marianne, Margaret, they've lived in this house forever, well, since they were born. They're with their father and their mother, and all of a sudden their lives turn upside down because of this law and the settlement by entailment. And they are forced to live in their own home as visitors because overnight the house is no longer theirs but belongs to their half brother and his wife. So you can imagine. And they have to look for somewhere else to live, somewhere else much smaller, much simpler, because they have to afford it they have to afford the rent with their own money. A continuance in a place where everything reminded her of former delight was exactly what suited her mind. In seasons of cheerfulness, no temper could be more cheerful than hers, or possess in a greater degree that sanguine expectation of happiness which is happiness itself. But in sorrow she must be equally carried away by her fancy, and as far beyond consolation as in pleasure she was beyond alloy. Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of what her husband intended to do for his sisters. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. Now, John Dashwood's son would inherit the property at Norland Park, so £3,000 would not make much difference to his fortune. But see how Mrs. John Dashwood, Fanny is her name, exaggerates it. So it would impoverish him to the most dreadful degree. Mm-hmm. She begged him to think again on the subject. How could he answer it to himself to rob his child, and his only child too, of so large a sum? And what possible claim could the Miss Dashwoods, who were related to him only by half-blood, which she considered as no relationship at all, have on his generosity to so large an amount? It was very well known that no affection was ever supposed to exist between the children of any man by different marriages. And why was he to ruin himself and their poor little Harry by giving away all his money to his half-sisters? So, parenthesis here now. This paragraph is in the third person, right? But it is a third person that goes, it's a narrator that goes inside Mrs. Joan Dashwood's mind. And we are reading here a description of the events, not as a neutral, objective bystander, but through Mrs. Joan Dashwood's own mind. And hence the use of exaggerated language, like would impoverish their son to the most dreadful degree, would rob his child of all that money. And the comments that she makes on how they were barely related, they were children of the same father. And you see Jane Austen's bitter sarcasm, as she says, no affection was ever supposed to exist between the children of any man by different marriages. Of course, um, she does not mean that, but it is how the character Mrs. Joan Dashwood feels, and perhaps not how, maybe not how she feels, but how she's supposed to feel in this situation so she can turn things to her own advantage. What do you think about this character, Mrs. John Dashwood? Terrible, right? She is just terrible. Let's see their conversation. Type in the chat your opinions on Mrs. Joan Dashwood. It was my father's last request to me, replied her husband, that I should assist his widow and daughters. He did not know what he was talking of, I dare say. 10 to 1, but he was light-headed at the time. Had he been in his right senses, he could not have thought of such a thing as begging you to give away half your fortune from your own child. He did not stipulate for any particular sum, my dear Fanny. He only requested me, in general terms, to assist them and make their situation more comfortable than it was in his power to do. Perhaps it would have been as well if he had left it wholly to myself. He could hardly suppose I should neglect them. But as he required the promise, I could not do less than give it. At least I thought so at the time. The promise, therefore, was given and must be performed. Something must be done for them whenever they leave Norland and settle in a new home. Oh, well, then, let something be done for them, but that something need not be £3,000. Consider, she added, that when the money is once parted with, it never can return. Your sisters will marry, and it will be gone forever, if indeed it could ever be restored to our poor little boy. Why, to be sure, said her husband very gravely. That will make a great difference. The time may come when Harry will regret that so large a sum was parted with. If he should have a numerous family, for instance, it would be a very convenient addition. To be sure it would. Perhaps then it would be better for all parties if the sum were diminished one half. £500 would be a prodigious increase to their fortunes. Oh, beyond anything, this great. What brother on earth would do half so much for his sisters, even if really his sisters? And as it is only half blood, but you have such a generous spirit. You see how manipulative Fanny Dashwood is, right? She has just manipulated her husband into diminishing what he had intended to give his sisters in half. So instead of giving each £1,000, now he's thinking of giving each £500. I would not wish to do anything mean, he replied. One had rather on such occasions do too much than too little. No one at least can think I have not done enough for them. Even themselves, they can hardly expect more. There is no knowing what they may expect, said the lady. But we are not to think of their expectations. The question is what you can afford to do. Certainly. And I think I may afford to give them £500 apiece. As it is, without any addition of mine, they will each have above £3,000 on their mother's death, a very comfortable fortune for any young woman. To be sure it is. Indeed, it strikes me that they can want no addition at all. They will have £10,000 divided amongst them. If they marry, they will be sure of doing well, and if they do not, they may all live very comfortably together on the interest of £10,000. That is very true, and therefore I do not know whether, upon the whole, it would not be more advisable to do something for their mother while she lives, rather than for them. Something of the annuity kind, I mean. My sisters would feel the good effects of it as well as herself. 100 a year would make them all perfectly comfortable. So now she made him change again. So from £1,000 each to £500 each. And now maybe they don't need it at all because, they're going to have such a simple life. They won't marry. They don't need this money. So instead, he thinks of giving their mother an annuity. Now, do you know what that is? There is a footnote here. Um, let me always at hand. Let me take a look. Chapter 2, number 7. Yes. The annuity is the grant of a periodical sum of money to persons for a term of years, for life, or in perpetuity, and thus inheritable. So then, instead of giving the girls money when their mother died, he thought of giving their mother a little bit of money, £100, I think, each year, so they could all profit from that now. His wife hesitated a little, however, in giving her consent to this plan. To be sure, said she, it is better than parting with £1,500 at once. But then if Mrs. Dashwood should live 15 years, we shall be completely taken in. 15 years, my dear Fanny, her life cannot be her life cannot be worth half that purchase. Certainly not, but if you observe, people always live forever when there is any annuity to be paid them. And she's very stout and healthy and hardly 40. An annuity is a very serious business. It comes over and over every year, and there is no getting rid of it. You are not aware of what you're doing. I have known a great deal of the trouble of annuities, for my mother was clogged with the payment of 3 to old superannuated servants by my father's will, and it is amazing how disagreeable she found it. It is indeed amazing, right? When she refers to old superannuated servants, it means servants that were disqualified or incapacitated by age. So then her mother, because it was stipulated in her father's will that she should pay an annuity to these servants. But it was such a nightmare. Twice every year, these annuities were to be paid. And then there was the trouble of getting it to them. And then one of them was said to have died, and afterwards it turned out to be no such thing. My mother was quite sick of it. Her income was not her own, she said, with such perpetual claims on it. And it was the more unkind in my father because otherwise the money would have been entirely at my mother's disposal without any restriction whatsoever. It has given me such an abhorrence of annuities that I am sure I would not pin myself down to the payment of one for all the world. It is certainly an unpleasant thing, replied Mr. Dashwood, to have those kind of yearly drains on one's income. One's fortune, as your mother justly says, is not one's own. To be tied down to the regular payment of such a sum on every rent day is by no means desirable. It takes away one's independence. Undoubtedly, and after all you have no thanks for it. They think themselves secure, you do no more than what is expected, and it raises no gratitude at all. If I were you, whatever I did should be done at my own discretion entirely. I would not bind myself to allow them anything yearly. It may be very inconvenient some years to spare 100 or even £50 from our own expenses. I believe you're right, my love. It will be better that there should be no annuity in the case. Whatever I may give them occasionally will be of far greater assistance than a yearly allowance, because they would only enlarge their style of living if they felt sure of a larger income, and would not be sixpence the richer for it at the end of the year. It will certainly be much the best way. A present of £50 now and then will prevent their ever being distressed for money, and will, I think, be amply discharging my promise to my father. So now, instead of an annuity, he's thinking of giving them a present of £50 now and then. See what's happening here? What a manipulative woman Fanny Dashwood is. To be sure it will. Indeed, to say the truth, I am convinced within myself that your father had no idea of your giving them any money at all. The assistance he thought of, I dare say, was only such as might be reasonably expected of you. For instance, such as looking out for a comfortable small house for them, helping them to move their things, and sending them presents of fish and game, and so forth, whenever they are in season. I'll lay my life that he meant nothing farther, Indeed, it would be very strange and unreasonable if he did. Exaggeration. Do but consider, my dear Mr. Dashwood, how excessively comfortable your mother in law and her daughters may live on the interest of £7,000, besides the £1,000 belonging to each of the girls, which brings them in £50 a year apiece. And of course, they will pay their mother for their board out of it. Altogether, they will have 50 hundred a year amongst them, and what on earth can four women want for more than that? They will live so cheap, their housekeeping will be nothing at all. They will have no carriage, no horses, and hardly any servants. They will keep no company and can have no expenses of any kind. Only conceive how comfortable they will be. 500 a year. I am sure I cannot imagine how they will spend half of it. And as to your giving them more, it is quite absurd to think of it. They will be much more able to give you something. So she has completely turned the tables around. So now she's saying that they will have such a simple life. They don't need this, they don't need that. I don't know what they could use the money for. In fact, I think they will have so much money left that they might give the money to you instead of the other way around. Unbelievable. Michelle says she's a master manipulator. Indeed, she is. It's quite funny to read, right? The way the conversation goes, but she is. So there is an interesting footnote here that I would like to share with you about this situation. That she says that they won't need much because they will have such a simpler life. A tone similar to that taken by Jane Austen's brother Henry in congratulating his brothers on their arrangements for their mother and sisters after the death of Reverend George Austen in 1805. The women would be in the receipt of a clear £450 per year, which he reckoned, and now quoting from Jane Austen's brother, very comfortable, and as a smaller establishment will be as agreeable to them as it cannot but be feasible, I really think that my mother and sisters will be to the full as rich as ever. Since Harry was never known to keep his thoughts to himself, it seems likely these generous sentiments were known throughout the family. So can you imagine? So the people, especially men, and in this case, Fanny Dashwood, because she's speaking on behalf of her own son, they think that women have no pleasures, no ambitions, no desires at all. All they need to do is survive in a comfortable space. Money for extra things, for amusement, for different kind of foods, for servants to help, for different type of transportation, for traveling. No, that's not necessary, because a woman should be at home just being there, right? And if you don't have a husband, if you don't have children, then there's nothing you need to do, no practical things, so you can just exist, right? Upon my word, said Mr. Dashwood, I believe you're perfectly right. My father certainly could mean nothing more by his request to me than what you say. Of course not. I clearly understand it now, and I will strictly fulfill my engagement by such acts of assistance and kindness to them as you have described. When my mother removes into another house, my services shall be readily given to accommodate her as far as I can. Some little present of furniture, too, may be acceptable then. Oh, certainly, returned Mrs. Joan Dashwood. But she always agrees and then adds a but. But, however, one thing must be considered. When your father and mother moved to Norland, though the furniture of Stanhill was sold, all the china, plate, and linen was saved, and is now left to your mother. Her house will therefore be almost completely fitted up as soon as she takes it. That is a material consideration, undoubtedly, a valuable legacy indeed. And yet, some of the plate would have been a very pleasant addition to our own stock here. Yes, and the set of breakfast china is twice as handsome as what belongs to this house. A great deal too handsome, in my opinion, for any place they can ever afford to live in. But however, so it is. Your father thought only of them. And I must say this, that you owe no particular gratitude to him, nor attention to his wishes. For we very well know that if he could, he would have left almost everything in the world to them. This argument was irresistible. It gave to his intentions whatever of decision was wanting before, and he finally resolved that it would be absolutely unnecessary, if not highly indecorous, to do more for the widow and children of his father than such kind of neighborly acts as his own wife pointed out. And that's the end of the chapter. Megan says, Fanny Dashwood is very eloquent and she knows that her husband can be easily persuaded. Yes, as a woman, she has a lot of power in that sense. She controls her husband very well. Megan says she has no compassion or love, and I think the only reason why she married into the Dashwood family was for the money. Definitely, it was not a love match. This is completely opposite to what Jane Austen feels what marriage should be, and you can sense the bitter sarcasm and criticism in Jane Austen's words, right, as she's describing this terrible conversation and this terrible relationship between the two. Jenny says she's very good at getting her husband to change his mind. She is the master of the house. Although legally she has no power, she has control over his mind, but she can only exercise that power as long as she remains his wife, right? So look at what happened in this conversation. So first, John Dashwood had thought of giving each of his sisters £1,000 each, but then he thought maybe £500 each is enough, and that maybe just an annuity for Mrs. Dashwood, and then a gift of £50 every now and then would be sufficient. Then maybe that's not necessary at all, just assistance with moving to a new house. And eventually he decided, you know what? I'll just offer them such kind of neighborly acts. Jenny says the sarcasm definitely comes across. So you see, because of this conversation, Fanny Dashwood plays an important role in shaping the future of the Dashwood girls, because they're left with nothing, and that will be very hard when they have to choose a husband, because as you know, it was a business transaction, so they could only marry well if they had money to give, as a dowry. All right, so let's start chapter 3. Now it starts from a different perspective, you see. Now it is third person narrative, but it is Mrs. Dashwood's perspective. Mrs. Dashwood meaning the mother of the girls. Let's take a look. Mrs. Dashwood remained at Norland several months, not from any disinclination to move when the sight of every well-known spot ceased to raise the violent emotion which it produced for a while, for when her spirits began to revive and her mind became capable of some other exertion than that of heightening its affliction by melancholy remembrances, she was impatient to be gone, and indefatigable in her inquiries for a suitable dwelling in the neighborhood of Norland. For to remove far from that beloved spot was impossible. But she could hear of no situation that at once answered her notions of comfort and ease, and suited the prudence of her eldest daughter, whose steadier judgment rejected several houses as too large for their income, which her mother would have approved. Now let's see, what kind of a character do you think Mrs. Dashwood is? She's so good at heart, but she has no knowledge of money at all. She would just spend, because that's the kind of life she was accustomed with until now. We don't know how old she is. All of a sudden, she has to change her lifestyle. But luckily, she has a very prudent daughter, Eleanor, the sense in Sensibility, who tells her to not to accept certain options. Mrs. Dashwood had been informed by her husband of the solemn promise on the part of his son in their favor, which gave comfort to his last earthly reflections. She doubted the sincerity of this assurance no more than he had doubted it himself, and she thought of it for her daughter's sake with satisfaction, though as for herself, she was persuaded that a much smaller provision than £7,000 would support her in affluence. in affluence, so she has really no knowledge of money or worth or value of things, because that much money would not be enough to keep her in the same lifestyle she was used to, and definitely not in affluence. Um, for their brother's sake, too, for the sake of his own heart, she rejoiced. And she reproached herself for being unjust to his merit before, in believing him incapable of generosity. In fact, she was right, right? Perhaps it's not him, but the influence of his wife that made him even more um, not generous. His attentive behavior to herself and his sisters convinced her that their welfare was dear to him, and for a long time she firmly relied on the liberality of his intentions. The contempt which she had very early in their acquaintance felt for her daughter in law was very much increased by further knowledge of her character, which half a year's residence in her family afforded. And perhaps in spite of every consideration of politeness or maternal affection on the side of the former, the two ladies might have found it impossible to have lived together so long had not a particular circumstance occurred to give still greater eligibility, according to the opinion of Mrs. Dashwood, to her daughter's continuance at Norland. So let's see, what situation is this? The circumstance was a growing attachment between her eldest girl and the brother of Mrs. John Dashwood, a gentlemanlike and pleasing young man who was introduced to their acquaintance soon after his sister's establishment at Norland, and who had since spent the greatest part of his time there. Some mothers might have encouraged the intimacy from motives of interest, for Edward Ferrars was the eldest son of a man who had died very rich, and some might have repressed it from motives of prudence, for except a trifling sum, the whole of his fortune depended on the will of his mother. But Mrs. Dashwood was alike uninfluenced by either consideration. It was enough for her that he appeared to be amiable, that he loved her daughter, and that Eleanor returned the partiality. It was contrary to every doctrine of hers that difference of fortune should keep any couple asunder who were attracted by a resemblance of the position, and that Eleanor's merit should not be acknowledged by every one who knew her was to her comprehension impossible. So look what a caring mother Mrs. Dashwood is. So she would be gone from that house, but when she realizes that there's something happening between Eleanor and the brother of Fanny Dashwood, Edward Ferrars, she decides to stay, not because it would be a profitable match for her daughter, but because she sees that they truly care for one another. And she does not believe that any difference of fortune should keep people that like each other apart. Now, let's see. It's the introduction of Edward Ferrars, so the love interest of Eleanor. Let's see how he is described. Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any peculiar graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. He was too diffident to do justice to himself, but when his natural shyness was overcome, his behavior gave every indication of an open, affectionate heart. His understanding was good, and his education had given it solid improvement. But he was neither fitted by abilities nor disposition to answer the wishes of his mother and sister, who longed to see him distinguished, as they hardly knew what. They wanted him to make a fine figure in the world in some manner or other. His mother wished to interest him in political concerns, to get him into Parliament, or to see him connected with some of the great men of the day. Mrs. John Dashwood wished it likewise. But in the meanwhile, till one of these superior blessings could be attained, it would have quieted her ambition to see him driving a barouche. But Edward had no turn for great men or barouches. All his wishes centered in domestic comfort and the quiet of private life. Fortunately, he had a younger brother who was more promising. So he was not handsome, he didn't speak well, he was quite shy, and he didn't care for such ambitions and a lavish lifestyle. He did not even care for driving in a barouche. Now, this is funny, so let me read it to you. Uh, what it means, a barouche, and why Jane Austen mentions that. Um, a barouche is an expensive open carriage now used for royal state occasions, but in the early 19th century used for fast amateur driving by fashionable young men. An ambition appropriate to the principles and tastes of Mrs. Ferrers and her daughter Fanny. But Edward does not care for driving barouches. He's completely fine. All he wants is a domestic comfort and the quiet of a private life. And that goes 100% with what Eleanor wants and her lifestyle and her, not even, we cannot even call them ambitions, her desires in life. And this is an interesting story. Jane Austen rode in her banker brother Henry's barouche in London, and she wrote the following in a letter. The carriage being open was very pleasant. I liked my solitary elegance very much, and was ready to laugh all the time at my being where I was. I could not but feel that I had naturally small right to be parading about London in a barouche. So a barouche was a symbol of status, of fortune, right? Of fashion as well. But Edward doesn't care about that. Edward had been staying several weeks in the house before he engaged much of Mrs. Dashwood's attention, for she was at that time in such affliction as rendered her careless of surrounding objects. She saw only that he was quiet and unobtrusive, and she liked him for it. He did not disturb the wretchedness of her mind by ill-timed conversation. She was first called to observe and approve him further by a reflection which Eleanor chanced one day to make on the difference between him and his sister. It was a contrast which recommended him most forcibly to her mother. It is enough, said she, to say that he is unlike Fanny is enough. It implies everything amiable. I love him already. I think you will like him, said Eleanor, when you know more of him. Like him, replied her mother with a smile. I can feel no sentiment of approbation inferior to love. She's very exaggerated, like Marianne. There's no such thing as like in her vocabulary. She can only love. And Eleanor says, you may esteem him. I have never yet known what it was to separate esteem and love. Mrs. Dashwood now took pains to get acquainted with him. Her manners were attaching and soon banished his reserve. She speedily comprehended all his merits, the persuasion of his regard for Eleanor, and perhaps assisted her penetration. But she really felt assured of his worth, and even that quietness of manner which militated against all her established ideas of what a young man's address ought to be, was no longer uninteresting when she knew his heart to be warm and his temper affectionate. So he's far from being the ideal gentleman in Mrs. Dashwood's mind. So you see that the mother and Eleanor have different love ideals. But when she realizes that he has a warm heart and affectionate temper, she begins to love him. No sooner did she perceive any symptom of love in his behavior to Eleanor than she considered their serious attachment as certain and looked forward to their marriage as rapidly approaching. Remember, we talk about discretion, right? So if you start to show affection in public, that means much more than it would mean nowadays. That means that there was already a discussion or an agreement, an engagement perhaps, and the marriage would take place soon. In a few months, my dear Marianne, said she, Eleanor will in all probability be settled for life. We shall miss her, but she will be happy. Oh, mamma, how shall we do without her? My love, it will be scarcely a separation. We shall live within a few miles of each other and shall meet every day of our lives. You will gain a brother, a real affectionate brother. I have the highest opinion in the world of Edward's heart. But you look grave, Marianne. Do you disapprove your sister's choice? Perhaps, said Marianne. I may consider it with some surprise. Now you see the difference in how Marianne sees Edward. Edward is Edward is very amiable, and I love him tenderly, but yet he's not the kind of young man. There is something wanting. His figure is not striking. It has none of that grace which I should expect in the man who could seriously attach my sister. His eyes want all that spirit, that fire, which at once announce virtue and intelligence. And besides all this, I am afraid, Mamma, he has no real taste. Music seems scarcely to attract him, and though he admires Eleanor's drawings very much, it is not the admiration of a person who can understand their worth. It is evident, in spite of his frequent attention to her while she draws, that in fact he knows nothing of the matter. He admires as a lover, not as a connoisseur. To satisfy me, those characters must be united. Now let's see what she wants in a love match. I could not be happy with a man whose taste did not in every point coincide with my own. He must enter into all my feelings. He must, yeah, the same books, the same music must charm us both. Oh, Mamma, how spiritless, how tame was Edward's manner in reading to us last night. I felt for my sister most severely, yet she bore it with so much composure, she seemed scarcely to notice it. I could hardly keep my seat. To hear those beautiful lines which have frequently almost driven me wild, pronounced with such impenetrable calmness, such dreadful indifference. So Marian wants fire, virtue, intelligence. She wants wildness. And Edward is calm, indifferent, serious, right? And what do you think about Marianne's convictions of her wants or her wants in love? Someone who shares all her feelings, the same taste in books, the same taste in music, and whose taste coincides in every point with hers. What do you think about her love expectations? Let me know. He would certainly have done more justice to simple and elegant prose. I thought so at the time, but you would give him Cooper. Now, Cooper is a poet, and he was reading, apparently, Edward was reading Cooper's poetry terribly, without energy. Nay, Mamma, if he is not to be animated by Cooper, but we must allow for difference of taste. Eleanor has not my feelings, and therefore she may overlook it and be happy with it. But it would have broken my heart had I loved him to hear him read with so little sensibility. Mamma, the more I know of the world, the more I am convinced that I shall never see a man whom I can really love. I require so much. He must have all Edward's virtues, and his person and manners must ornament his goodness with every possible charm. Remember, my love, that you are not 17. It is yet too early in life to despair of such a happiness. Why should you be less fortunate than your mother? In one circumstance only, my Marianne, may your destiny be different from hers. Beautiful and funny conversation between mother and daughter. Two very, two women that are very, very passionate and emotional, and they just cannot understand Eleanor's taste. But, we're different people. So if she loves him and he's a very good person, we're fine. So in this chapter, we see the characterization of Edward Ferrars, not directly, but through what other people think of him. And you see the contrast between Edward and the shallow lifestyle and opinion of Mrs. Ferrars and John's wife. So they're completely different. And that's what makes Mrs. Dashwood like Edward. And Marianne's love ideal and unreasonable aspirations. Let me know what you think of her love aspirations. Now, chapter 4 is really nice. I really like it. It is a conversation between Eleanor and Marianne, and we get to know them better. Especially Eleanor, she's been quite quiet, but that's part of her character. She is quite quiet, and we'll see how they talk about love in a different way. It's a very, very nice chapter. Okay, so it's sisters talking. What a pity it is, Eleanor, said Marianne, that Edward should have no taste for drawing. That's important for Marianne. No taste for drawing, replied Eleanor. Why should you think so? He does not draw himself, indeed, but he has great pleasure in seeing the performances of other people. And I assure you he is by no means deficient in natural taste, though he has not had opportunities of improving it. Had he ever been in the way of learning, I think he would have drawn very well. He distrusts his own judgment in such matters so much that he is always unwilling to give his opinion on any picture. But he has an innate propriety and simplicity of taste, which in general direct him perfectly right. So Eleanor appreciates this propriety and simplicity of taste. Megan says, definitely resonate with Marianne's want for passionate love. My thoughts, please don't butcher the beauty of reading something so beautiful. Yes, that happens here when Edward, there are some movie adaptations in which you can see Edward reading and Marianne's reaction, like, what are you doing? You're butchering the beauty of poetry. Megan says, this is aimed toward Edward's way of reading to them. I can just feel the frustration of Marianne. Something similar happens in Pride and Prejudice when Mr. Collins is reading a sermon, then not poetry, and Lydia is just so bored. But this, in Sense and Sensibility, it's different because Marianne thinks it's so boring and so without taste, but Eleanor appreciates. Oh yes, Megan says, Hugh Grant, he killed me. Exactly, that's the one I'm referring to. Great adaptation of Sense and Sensibility. But Eleanor appreciates that, the simplicity and the discretion. Marianne was afraid of offending and said no more on the subject, but the kind of approbation which Eleanor described as excited in him by the drawings of other people was very far from the rapturous delight which, in her opinion, could alone be called taste. Pay attention to the contrast of vocabulary, right? So Eleanor is propriety, simplicity, approbation, and Marianne is delight, rapturous, taste. See. Yet, though smiling within herself at the mistake, she honored her sister for that blind partiality to Edward which produced it. Jenny says, I watched the film with Hugh Grant and Kate Winslet, and that part was very well done. Yes, I want to watch this film again. Yes, it's a great film. And whenever I think of Marianne and Dashwood, I can only think about, the Kate Winslet, right? And Emma Thompson. Is that it? But great, great actors. I hope, Marianne, continued Eleanor, you do not consider him as deficient in general taste. Indeed, I think I may say that you cannot, for your behavior to him is perfectly cordial, and if that were your opinion, I am sure you could never be civil to him. Because Marianne cannot hold her real feelings. Marianne hardly knew what to say. She would not wound the feelings of her sister on any account, and yet to say what she did not believe in was impossible. At length she replied, Emma Thompson as Eleanor, exactly. Do not be offended, Eleanor, if my praise of him is not in everything equal to your sense of his merits. I have not had so many opportunities of estimating the minuter propensities of his mind, his inclinations and tastes as you have, but I have the highest opinion in the world of his goodness and sense. I think him everything that is worthy and amiable. I am sure, replied Eleanor with a smile, that his dearest friends could not be dissatisfied with such commendation as that. I do not perceive how you could express yourself more warmly. Marianne was rejoiced to find her sister so easily pleased with words such as worthy and amiable. Of his sense and goodness, continued Eleanor, no one can, I think, be in doubt, who has seen him often enough to engage him in unreserved conversation. So we've seen Mrs. Dashwood's perception of Edward, Marianne's perception of Edward. Now let's look at Eleanor's perception of Edward. The excellence of his understanding and his principles can be concealed only by that shyness which too often keeps him silent. You know enough of him to do justice to his solid worth, but of his minuter propensities, as you call them, you have from peculiar circumstances been kept more ignorant than myself. He and I have been at times thrown a good deal together, while you have been wholly engrossed on the most affectionate principle by my mother. I have seen a great deal of him, have studied his sentiments, and heard his opinion on subjects of literature and taste, and upon the whole, I venture to pronounce that his mind is well informed, his enjoyment of books exceedingly great, his imagination lively, his observation just and correct, and his taste delicate and pure. His abilities in every respect improve as much upon acquaintance as his manners and person. At first sight, his address is certainly not striking, and his person can hardly be called handsome, till the expression of his eyes, which are uncommonly good, and the general sweetness of his countenance is perceived. At present, I know him so well that I think him really handsome, or at least almost so. What say you, Marianne? I shall very soon think him handsome, Eleanor, if I do not now. Meaning she doesn't. When you tell me to love him as a brother, I shall no more see imperfection in his face than I now do in his heart. Eleanor started at this declaration and was sorry for the warmth she had been betrayed into in speaking of him. She felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed the regard to be mutual, but she required greater certainty of it to make Marianne's conviction of their attachment agreeable to her. She knew that what Marianne and her mother conjectured one moment, they believed the next. That with them to wish was to hope, and to hope was to expect. She tried to explain the real state of the case to her sister. Eleanor wanted proof, security, so she needed Edward to say that he liked her back in order for her to accept. But Marianne and her mother don't need that. From what they see, it's all settled. And when they what is it? When they wish, then they hope, and when they hope, they expect, and when they expect, they believe. I do not attempt to deny, said she, that I think very highly of him, that I greatly esteem, that I like him. Marianne here burst forth with indignation. I love this part. Esteem him? Like him? Cold-hearted Eleanor. Oh, worse than cold-hearted, ashamed of being otherwise. Use those words again, and I will leave the room this moment. Eleanor could not help laughing. These words are not part of Marian's vocabulary either. Esteem and like her mother said before, especially to someone whom you love. Eleanor clearly loves Edward. She should not be afraid to use the word love, but she is, so she uses other less powerful words. But Marianne does not accept that. Excuse me, said she, and be assured that I meant no offense to you by speaking in so quiet a way of my own feelings. Believe them to be stronger than I have declared. Believe them, in short, to be such as his merit and the suspicion, the hope of his affection for me may warrant, without imprudence or folly. She does not accept that. But farther than this you must not believe. I am by no means assured of his regard for me. There are moments when the extent of it seems doubtful. Until his sentiments are fully known, you cannot wonder at my wishing to avoid any encouragement of my own partiality by believing or calling it more than it is. In my heart, I feel little, scarcely any doubt of his preference, but there are other points to be considered besides his inclination. Now, she's the sense, right? She sees beyond affection, so she looks at the practicalities of their engagement. He is very far from being independent. What his mother really is, we cannot know. But from Fanny's occasional mention of her conduct and opinions, we have never been disposed to think her amiable. And I am very much mistaken if Edward is not himself aware that there would be many difficulties in his way if he were to wish to marry a woman who had not either a great fortune nor high rank. So Eleanor is wise and contained. She doesn't raise expectation. She only believes in facts. Marianne was astonished to find how much the imagination of her mother and herself had outstripped the truth. And you really are not engaged to him, said she. Yet it certainly soon will happen. But two advantages will proceed from this delay. I shall not lose you so soon, and Edward will have greater opportunity of improving the natural taste for your favorite pursuit, which must be so indispensably necessary to your future felicity. Oh, if he should be so far stimulated by your genius as to learn to draw himself, how delightful it would be. She's so naive, Marianne, right? Eleanor had given her real opinion to her sister. She could not consider her partiality for Edward in so prosperous a state as Marianne had believed it. There was at times a want of spirits about him, which, if it did not denote indifference, spoke as something almost as unpromising. Now we're reading this paragraph through Eleanor's point of view. So you see, it's more, not many adjectives. It's very concise, very objective, right? Like her own way of thinking, very practical. A doubt of her regard, supposing him to feel it, need not give him more than inquietude. It would not be likely to produce that dejection of mind which frequently attended him. A more reasonable cause might be found in the dependent situation which forbade the indulgence of his affection. She knew that his mother neither behaved to him so as to make his home comfortable at present, nor to give him any assurance that he might form a home for himself without strictly attending to her views for his aggrandizement. With such a knowledge as this, it was impossible for Eleanor to feel easy on the subject. She was far from depending on that result of his preference of her, which her mother and sister still considered as certain. Nay, the longer they were together, the more doubtful seemed the nature of his regard, and sometimes, for a few painful minutes, she believed it to be no more than friendship. And she's so discreet that she will not talk to him. She will keep that pain to herself, that uncertainty to herself, that uncertainty that kills her. But whatever might really be its limits, it was enough, when perceived by his sister, to make her uneasy, and at the same time, which was still more common, to make her uncivil. She took the first opportunity of affronting her mother-in-law on the occasion, talking to her so expressively of her brother's great expectations, of Mrs. Ferrars's resolution that both her sons should marry well, and of the danger attending any young woman who attempted to draw him in. That Mrs. Dashwood could neither pretend to be unconscious nor endeavor to be calm. She couldn't hide her feelings like Marianne. She gave her an answer which marked her contempt, and instantly left the room, resolving that whatever might be the inconvenience or expense of so sudden a removal, her beloved Eleanor should not be exposed another week to such insinuations. In this state of her spirits, a letter was delivered to her from the post, which contained a proposal particularly well timed. It was the offer of a small house, on very easy terms, belonging to a relation of her own, a gentleman of consequence and property in Devonshire. The letter was from this gentleman himself, and written in the true spirit of friendly accommodation. He understood that she was in need of a dwelling, and though the house he now offered her was merely a cottage, he assured her that everything should be done to it which she might think necessary if the situation pleased her. He earnestly pressed her, after giving the particulars of the house and garden, to come with her daughters to Barton Park, the place of his own residence. Barton Park, so a big estate, from whence she might judge herself whether Barton Cottage, where they would stay, for the houses were in the same parish, could by any alteration be made comfortable to her. He seemed really anxious to accommodate them, and the whole of his letter was written in so friendly a style as could not fail of giving pleasure to his cousin, more especially at a moment when she was suffering under the cold and unfeeling behavior of her nearer connections. She needed no time for deliberation or inquiry. Her resolution was formed as she read. The situation of Barton, in a county so far distant from Sussex as Devonshire, which but a few hours before would have been a sufficient objection to outweigh every possible advantage belonging to the place, was now its first recommendation. To quit the neighborhood of Norland was no longer an evil. It was an object of desire. It was a blessing in comparison of the misery of continuing her daughter-in-law's guest. And to remove her And to remove forever from that beloved place would be less painful than to inhabit or visit it while such a woman was its mistress. The distance between Norland and Barton was around 200 miles, so around 320 kilometers, which is already far in our perception of distance, modern perception of distance. Then it was very difficult to travel, especially in the countryside. So it would take a long time to travel this distance. So it was really, really far. But when Mrs. Dashwood heard the way that Fanny Dashwood was speaking about Edward's great expectations and how he should marry well, she was so distressed for the sake of Eleanor that she wanted to leave right away. She would not be a visitor in her own home. She instantly wrote Sir John Middleton her acknowledgment of his kindness and her acceptance of his proposal, and then hastened to show both letters to her daughters that she might be secure of their approbation before her answers were sent. How nice of her. First, she asks her daughters if they agree before sending the letters. Eleanor had always thought it would be more prudent for them to settle at some distance from Norland than immediately amongst their present acquaintance. On that head, therefore, it was not for her to oppose her mother's intention of removing into Devonshire. The house, too, as described by Sir John, was on so simple a scale, and the rent so uncommonly moderate, as to leave her no right of objection on either point. And therefore, though it was not a plan which brought any charm to her fancy, though it was a removal from the vicinity of Norland beyond her wishes, she made no attempt to dissuade her mother from sending her letter of acquiescence. You see how this paragraph, through Eleanor's perspective, she does not talk about her feelings directly. It's like a barrier for her, right? So she didn't want to leave because she would have to leave Edward behind. But she had already said before that it had to be a comfortable, affordable rent and that it was okay to be far from Norland. So she couldn't really change her mind now if she didn't want to betray her own desires and affections. So she just agrees. So she hides, she buries that passion within her. And that's terrible, right? She cannot handle her emotions. So in this chapter, we see the differences of Eleanor's and Marianne's perceptions of Edward Ferrars, Edward's great expectations as expected by his sister and mother, which would take him away from Eleanor as soon as possible. And because of that contempt for Eleanor, Mrs. Dashwood decides to accept Sir John Middleton's proposal and removes to Barton Cottage. Very well. So it's time to say goodbye to Norland, the house of their childhood, of their youth, of Mrs. Dashwood's happy married moments. So it is hard. Can you imagine? So let's take a look at the last chapter for today, chapter 5. No sooner was her answer dispatched than Mrs. Dashwood indulged herself in the pleasure of announcing to her son-in-law and his wife that she was provided with a house and should incommode them no longer than till everything were ready for her inhabiting it. She felt pleasure in sharing the news that she was leaving. They heard her with surprise. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband civilly hoped that she would not be settled far from Norland. She had great satisfaction in replying that she was going into Devonshire. Edward turned hastily toward her on hearing this, and in a voice of surprise and concern, which required no explanation to her, repeated, "Devonshire? Are you indeed going there? So far from hence? And to what part of it?" She explained the situation. It was within 4 miles northward of Exeter. "It is but a cottage," she continued, "but I hope to see many of my friends in it. A room or two can easily be added, and if my friends find no difficulty in traveling so far to see me, I am sure I will find none in accommodating them." And she uses the word friends twice in this short sentence to emphasize that she means only Edward, not the rest. She concluded with a very kind invitation to Mr. and Mrs. Joan to Mr. and Mrs. Joan Dashwood to visit her at Barton, and to Edward she gave one with still greater affection. Though her late conversation with her daughter-in-law had made her resolve on remaining at Norland no longer than was unavoidable, it had not produced the smallest effect on her in that point to which it principally intended. To separate Edward and Eleanor was as far from being her object as ever, and she wished to show Mrs. John Dashwood by this pointed invitation to her brother how totally she disregarded her disapprobation of the match. You see, they did not speak plainly because it was not considered proper. So instead of dealing with the elephant in the room, they would go around it, right? So by stating that Edward was welcome in their house meant that she approved of his relationship with her daughter. Mr. John Dashwood told his mother again and again how exceedingly sorry he was that she had taken a house at such a distance from Norland as to prevent his being of any service to her in removing her furniture. He really felt conscientiously vexed on the occasion, for the very exertion to which he had limited the performance of his promise to his father was by this arrangement rendered impracticable. The furniture was all sent round by water. It chiefly consisted of household linen, plate, china, and books, with a handsome pianoforte of Marianne's. Mrs. John Dashwood saw the packages depart with a sigh. She could not help feeling it hard that, as Mrs. Dashwood's income would be so trifling in comparison with their own, she could have any handsome article of furniture. She's terrible, so as she sees the pianoforte go, which was also a symbol of wealth, Mrs. John Dashwood sighs like, oh, what are they going to do with such a beautiful piece of furniture in that cottage they're going to? Megan says, we moved about a month ago, 1,400 kilometers from my old home, so the level of stress was a lot. But if I have to compare it, I can just imagine being forced from your home, losing your father, and then the person you fell in love with is just awful. Makes sense that she hides her feelings because it is the only coping mechanism. Exactly. And that's how the sisters differ. Eleanor copes by hiding everything, by showing a very calm and serious facade, quiet facade, but deep inside she's boiling with sentiments that she cannot show. On the contrary, Marianne does the opposite. She shows her feelings too much, and she feels too much, and that's also ends up being harmful for her. So you see that they both need to find a balance, and that's their journey in this book. They have to find a balance between sense and sensibility. So Mrs. Dashwood took the house for a 12-month. It was ready furnished, and she might have immediate possession. No difficulty arose on either side in the agreement, and she waited only for the disposal of her effects in Norland and to determine her future household before she set off for the West. And this, as she was exceedingly rapid in the performance of everything that interested her, was soon done. When she had her heart in things, they could be done fast. The horses which were left her by her husband had been sold soon after his death, and an opportunity now offering of disposing of her carriage, she agreed to sell that likewise at the earnest advice of her eldest daughter. Sell everything so they could have money. For the comfort of her children, had she consulted only her own wishes, she would have kept it. But the discretion of Eleanor prevailed. Her wisdom too limited the number of their servants to 3, 2 maids and a man, with whom they were speedily provided from amongst those who had formed their establishment at Norland. The man and one of the maids were sent off immediately into Devonshire to prepare the house for their mistress's arrival, for as Lady Middleton was entirely unknown to Mrs. Dashwood, she preferred going directly to the cottage to being a visitor at Barton Park, and she relied so undoubtingly on Sir John's description of the house as to feel no curiosity to examine it herself till she entered it as her own. Her eagerness to be gone from Norland was preserved from diminution by the evident satisfaction of her daughter in law in the prospect of her removal, a satisfaction which was but feebly attempted to be concealed under a cold invitation to her to defer her departure. Politeness, facade. Now was the time when her son in law's promise to his father might with particular propriety be fulfilled. Since he had neglected to do it on first coming to the state, their quitting his house might be looked on as the most suitable period for its accomplishment. But Mrs. Dashwood began shortly to give over every hope of the kind, and to be convinced from the general drift of his discourse that his assistance extended no farther than their maintenance for 6 months at Norland. He so frequently talked of the increasing expenses of housekeeping and of the perpetual demands upon his purse, which a man of any consequence in the world was beyond calculation exposed to, that he seemed rather to stand in need of money himself than to give any design of giving money away. In a very few weeks from the day which brought Sir John Middleton's first letter to Norland, everything was so far settled in their future abode as to enable Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters to begin their journey. Many were the tears shed by them in their last adieus to a place so much beloved. Dear, dear Norland, said Marianne as she wandered alone before the house on the last evening of their being there. When shall I cease to regret you? When learn to feel a home elsewhere? O happy house, could you know what I suffer in now viewing you from this spot, from whence perhaps I may view you no more? And you well-known trees, but you will continue the same. No leaf will decay because we are removed, nor any branch become motionless, although we can observe you no longer. No, you will continue the same, unconscious of the pleasure or the regret you occasion, and insensible of any change in those who walk under your shade. But who will remain to enjoy you? You see how dramatic Marianne is here, how she romanticizes the departure, how she pours forward her emotions, and she uses poetry to do so. So she relies on poetry, on art, so drawing, music, things that help her express her feelings that are really great and strong. So that's how she parts with her childhood home, thinking that this is the spot from which I will see you the last, the house, and all the trees that grew with us. But they will continue to be trees. The leaves will continue to fall. The branches will continue to move, even if we're not here. So it's a beautiful goodbye. And Eleanor doesn't say anything. She's quite probably hiding her feelings. And so they depart from Norland to Barton Cottage. And that's where we leave our adventure today. So it was a good moment to stop, because now it's the beginning of a new chapter in the Dashwood sisters' life. So they leave behind the comfort, the security of their childhood home, and they go somewhere else, somewhere unknown. So they have to create new connections, social connections. But they are also free to be whoever they want to be, since it's a new place, new opportunities. And as women, Eleanor is still quite young, not 17 yet, but as women with no or little money, they have to figure out a way to move forward with their lives. And of course, the main way to do that is through marriage. So we'll see how the relationship between Eleanor and Edward plays out. And we'll see if Marianne will ever be able to find or to live up to the expectations of her love ideals, her love aspirations, someone just like her. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this session. Let me know if the content is good, if it is too much for one session. I don't want it to extend for too long as well. So let me know if how it goes. Of course, if you're watching the recording, you can always pause after each chapter, go take a break, have another cup of tea, and come back. So next time we're meeting next Thursday. Jenny looks forward to next week. Me too. Next week, let me just check the date. It is the 16th of February, and we're going to talk about chapters 6 to 9 and the Dashwoods' new adventure into Barton Cottage and meeting a whole lot of new characters and in their journey of um, mature of being mature and finding a balance between sense and sensibility. Megan says she absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you all very much for the participation live and for your comments and your reactions. And I will see you next week for our session number 3. Bye bye and have a lovely week.